All right, on today's menu, what we're going to cover today is the endocrine system. And when we go over the endocrine system, we have to do a very brief comparison between the neural system and the endocrine system, because they're both controllers in some degree, right? The neural system and the endocrine system, they're working together to coordinate everything that's happening in your body. One is using somewhat of an electrical currency, and the other one is using like a hormonal currency. So the neural system can release neurotransmitters, whereas the endocrine system, these are going to release hormones. Okay, now remember, endocrine and exocrine, they're part of the same system, but they operate differently, right? Endocrine uses the blood supply. Exocrine is secreting something from glands, but it's releasing it to the epithelial surface, like the mammary glands and the sweat glands, okay? But the hormones are going to circulate through the blood, and they bind to these receptors. And the receptors are on target cells. Now, neurotransmitters, they too can also bind to receptors that are on target cells. Now, the exocrine glands, these are going to secrete their products not into bloodstream, but they're going to release them through these ducts. The sudiferous glands, those are your sweat glands, and the sebaceous glands, those are oil glands. Then we have mucus glands, digestive glands. These are all exocrine, not endocrine. Some glands are mixed. Okay, the pancreas is a biggie. The pancreas is a mixed gland because it has both endocrine and exocrine function. When we get to the pancreas, I'll make sure I point that out to you. So endocrine glands secrete hormones. Endocrine glands, they do not have ducts. Instead, they're going to secrete their hormones directly into the interstitial fluid that surrounds them. The hormones are going to diffuse into the blood. There's that word diffusion. You've learned that. It diffuses into the bloodstream through capillaries, and it's going to carry them to the target cell. There are a variety of endocrine glands. I'm going to show you a picture. We're going to go through a whole bunch, but the pituitary gland, the thyroid, the parathyroid, adrenal gland, pineal gland, these are just a few examples of endocrine glands. There are certain organs and tissues that are not part of the endocrine system, but these also are going to secrete hormones because they contain secreting type of cells. So secreting cells are found in the hypothalamus. Now the hypothalamus is in the brain, so it's kind of part of the neural system. Then you have the thymus. Well, the thymus is part of your immune system. Then you have the pancreas. Well, that's part of the digestive system. Then you have your ovaries and your testes. Well, that's part of the reproductive system. Then you have your kidneys. It's part of the urinary system. Stomach, liver, small intestine. Well, it's part of the digestive system. The skin is the integumentary system. Then heart. The heart. You mean the heart is an endocrine? Yeah, it has endocrine function. Believe it or not, the heart releases something called ANP. AN is in Nancy, P, atrial natriuretic polypeptide. It helps to regulate its own pressure. It's pretty amazing. Adipose tissue, whoa, fat? Oh my gosh, so you're telling me fat can act as an endocrine organ? Yes, it does. And the placenta itself. So really neat stuff. The endocrine's pretty dynamic. So let's take a look here and look at some of the key players in the endocrine system. So if we start up at the top here in the brain, you'll see that we have we have 3 lines going to the brain. The biggie is the H for hypothalamus. And then you have the pituitary. Now these two are very close cousins, the hypothalamus and the pituitary. In fact, they lie right next to each other. The hypothalamus is superior to the pituitary gland. And there are connections between the two. So your hypothalamus will release hormones that you see here in this box, and it will be sent to the pituitary gland. And then the pituitary gland releases a variety of hormones. And some of these hormones will act on the thyroid. Some will act on the adrenal gland. Some will act on the breasts. So there's a major connection just between the first three boxes on the left, between the hypothalamus, pituitary, and thyroid. We call this the Hpt axis. So your hypothalamus can release a hormone to the pituitary. Maybe it's going to the anterior lobe of the pituitary. And it's going to say, okay, we're going to release thyroid stimulating hormone. And that thyroid stimulating hormone is going to go to a target cell on the thyroid gland. And it tells the thyroid gland, hey, you're going to release T4, thyroxine. And then thyroxine gets converted to T3, triiodothyronine. And then T3 is involved in regulating your metabolism, which we'll see. So this is just one axis, the HPT axis, the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid. So your hypothalamus can release thyroid releasing hormone, TRH, and it goes to the pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, that's TSH. That goes to the thyroid gland, and the thyroid releases T4, and then T4 gets converted to T3. Some of that can happen in the thyroid, but believe it or not, a lot of people are unaware of this, but most of the T4 to T3 conversion takes place in the liver. That's right, it takes place in the liver, and it is dependent on a mineral called selenium. You need selenium to be part of this conversion of converting T4 to T3. But the majority of it takes place in the liver. A lot of people are unaware of that. Okay, so your hypothalamus and pituitary are connected. A thing I want to point out is that your pituitary has two lobes, an anterior and a posterior lobe. And each lobe is structured differently, and they release these different hormones. And in healthcare, it's really important to know what these abbreviations stand for. Because on blood work, typically you see them as abbreviations. Well, what is the GH level? What is the TSH level? What is the FSH level? So it's important to know that TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone, and GH is growth hormone, and PRL is prolactin releasing hormone, and FSH is follicle stimulating hormone, and LH is luteinizing hormone, and MSH is melanocyte stimulating hormone. And in the posterior lobe, there's oxytocin, and there's ADH. So ADH is anti-diuretic hormone. You know what a diuretic is, right? A diuretic is like coffee, alcohol. They make you urinate. That's a diuretic. So an anti-diuretic is going to allow you to hold on to water. Now, one of the things that's important to keep in mind, just some basic physiology, is that when you're holding on to water, you're going to hold on to minerals. All right? When you hold on to water, you hold on to minerals. Some of the water and minerals that go together, you're thinking sodium, you think potassium, you think magnesium. When you think of sodium, I think of salt, right? NaCl is salt, sodium chloride. So if you're holding on to water, you hold on to salt. Think about it. If someone has salt cravings, they're going to have French fries or potato chips or pretzels, something salty. And then they're going to go, oh my God, I'm thirsty, right? So they drink water. And then what's the next thing that happens? The blood pressure goes up, right? So when you hold on to water, you hold on to those minerals, sodium and chloride and magnesium and potassium. Water and minerals always go together. Now, if you lose minerals, it's typically secondary to losing water. And this is what happens when people use diuretics, right? If someone has high blood pressure and they take a diuretic because, let's say, their ankles have edema and they're swollen, they start losing water, but they lose minerals with it. And then their blood pressure goes down. Okay, so ADH is an anti diuretic hormone. So it's going to allow you to hold on to water, which means you're holding on to minerals, which means that's going to happen in instances in which your blood pressure dips, right, to try and maintain your pressure. Okay, so the hypothalamus, we have ADH and oxytocin. So the hypothalamus actually produces antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. It is the posterior lobe of the pituitary that stores it. Okay, hypothalamus produces it, the posterior lobe stores it and then releases it. The other name for the anterior lobe is called adenohypophysis, and the other name for posterior lobe is neurohypophysis. The word hypophysis, if you think back to osteology when you studied bones, in the skull, part of the sphenoid bone was the hypophyseal fossa. Right, that's where the sella turcica was. And the sella turcica is this depression where the hypophyseal fossa is. Hypophyseal fossa, neurohypophysis, adenohypophysis. So the hypophyseal fossa is this bony depression that houses the actual pituitary gland. And one of the things that we do when I look at x-rays on my patients and I'm looking at the person from this view, from the lateral view, and I look at a skull, there's actually a way of seeing the hypophyseal fossa, and there's a normal measurement of that bone. So we always take that measurement, and if the bone is larger, we can assume that the pituitary gland is enlarged. And if that corresponds clinically with a person having visual disturbances or eye problems, then we can pretty much say, okay, well, between their eye problems, between the expanded bone, the hypophyseal fossa, it probably means that the pituitary gland is swollen or large, like a pituitary tumor. And then you start looking at blood work, and you start looking at, well, are the anterior or posterior lobe hormones out of whack? Because if they are, then that completes the story. So for example, if I see an enlarged hypophyseal fossa gap or space here, and this clinically the individual is saying they're 25 or 30 years old and they grew 3 inches in 2 days, right? And they're not supposed to be growing. Well, if growth hormone is out of control, their bones are still going to get longer and they're going to get giantism, okay, or acromegalia. All right, so that's just some clinical gems there to whet your appetite. What else? Don't confuse the pituitary gland with pineal. Pineal is just above the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is the little brain back here. It deals with balance and coordination. This is the cerebellum. This is the cerebrum. Not to confuse cerebrum with cerebellum. The cerebellum is known as the little brain. It has more neurons than does the cerebrum, even though this is so small. And that's because I consider the cerebellum as a photocopy center. It actually gets a photocopy message of every motor command that your frontal lobe decides to do. So your frontal lobe says, hey, we're going to throw a baseball, and it's going to send a message to the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is going to send a message back to the frontal lobe to make sure that the action is done right, that you don't overthrow the ball, that it's precise, precision. So just above the cerebellum is the pineal, and that's going to release melatonin. This is part of your biological clock. It releases melatonin, not melanin. That's different, right? Melanin deals with skin pigmentation. Melatonin tones you down, right? Melatonin tones you down at night. It's released at night and it helps you sleep. Melatonin is not just a neurotransmitter that's released here in the brain, but it has favorable effects on the immune system. There's lots of beneficial effects on melatonin dealing with COVID-19 right now. A lot of peer-reviewed published literature on melatonin, and it greatly helps IBS symptoms, irritable bowel, very influential over the intestines. Parathyroid, right? What word do you see there? Parathyroid, you see the word thyroid. So thyroid and parathyroid are going to be working together. They work together to regulate calcium balance. And a lot of people don't know that the thyroid is involved in regulating calcium balance, because I didn't mention this hormone before called calcitonin. So besides the thyroid regulating metabolism with T4 and T3, thyroxine and triiodothyronine, the reason why T3 is triiodothyronine is that you need an amino acid called tyrosine. So when you have iodine, 4 iodines attached to 1 tyrosine, it's thyroxine. When you have 3 iodines attached to tyrosine, it's T3. Calcitonin is not related to these two. It's involved in calcium regulation. You can see the beginning of the word, calc, like calcium. Calcitonin and parathyroid hormone, PTH, they work synergistically and antagonistically, meaning they work together, but in opposite ways. So they work together to regulate calcium. One is designed to decrease the amount of calcium that you have in blood, and the other is designed to increase the amount of calcium you have in blood. And when we get to these glands, I'll show you more specifics. But calcium regulation is important because calcium is involved in muscle contraction, nerve impulses, blood clotting, and it's a cofactor in allowing certain enzymes to work. So thyroid and parathyroid, you should study those together and how they regulate calcium balance in the body. The adrenal gland, that's a biggie, right? This one shows up quite a bit on the lab exam, so you want to make sure that you know that the adrenal gland is made up of an adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla, and you want to know what they look like microscopically, right? Histologically, that is. So the adrenal cortex, whenever you hear the word cortex, the cortex comes from the word bark, like not bark like a dog, but bark of a tree, right? It's the outer protective layer to a tree. That's the cortex. And you even have a cortex in the brain. It's called the cerebral cortex. It looks like the bark of a tree, right? So the adrenal cortex pushes out a lot of the C's, like cortisol, cortisone, corticosterone. It also pushes out aldosterone and androgens. These are sex hormones, like testosterone. That's on the outer portion. The inner portion is called the adrenal medulla. And the adrenal medulla pushes out these 2 catecholamines. These 2 catecholamines are called epinephrine and norepinephrine. Whenever you hear of the adrenals, right, like he or she had an adrenaline rush, you think of like they have this incredible amount of power and they can flip over a car, right? So this stimulates the sympathetics. This is involved with the sympathetic nervous system, which is part of the autonomic nervous system. So the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, has these 2 divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. And the sympathetics are going to, it's like the accelerator, right? It speeds up your heart rate, speeds up your breathing rate. It's going to dilate your pupils like you're in danger and you can't see at night and you want to get out of danger's way, right? That's a sympathetic response, but it slows down your digestion. Your parasympathetics is like the brake. Sympathetic is the accelerator. The parasympathetic is like the brakes, right? It slows down your heart rate. It relaxes you, helps you sleep at night, slows down your breathing, but it does speed up digestion. That's the only thing it does speed up. And that's why your grandmother or mother would have said to you, you know, after you eat, don't go swimming or don't go playing, because after you eat, you need parasympathetics engaged to digest your food. If you're out running, well, outside running is a sympathetic response. And you can get indigestion because what's happening is you're shunting blood away from your digestive tract and you're shunting it to your quads and your running muscles, right, to play and just to get out of danger's way. And you get blood away from the intestines to absorb all those nutrients. So there's a little bit of a practical application to sympathetic and parasympathetic. So the adrenal medulla, epinephrine and norepinephrine, these are directly linked to the neural system, and they speed everything up. When you think of cortisone or cortisol, these are response with inflammation. They're also involved with the immune system, with inflammatory reactions. Pancreas, insulin and glucagon are the two biggies. Insulin is released from the beta cells, and glucagon is released from the alpha cells. And insulin and glucagon are both the blood sugar regulators. They just do it in opposite ways. Much like the thyroid and parathyroid regulate calcium in opposite ways, the insulin and glucagon are going to regulate blood sugar or glucose in different ways. Insulin is designed to lower your blood sugar, and if it gets too low, glucagon is designed to raise blood sugar. Okay, and then let's just move on to some of these other accessory organs. You heard me mention the heart before. The heart secretes ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide, even brain natriuretic peptide. They're really designed to help protect blood pressure because you don't want to get a stroke, right? You don't want to have a heart attack. So these allow the body to get rid of, if you look at the beginning of natriuretic, well, it sounds like a diuretic, but natrium, if you look at the first two letters, Na is sodium. So this allows the body to get rid of sodium to try and lower blood pressure. Whereas if we go to the left side under the adrenal cortex, aldosterone, that's designed to retain and hold on to sodium. And remember, if you're holding on to sodium, that's usually secondary to water retention. So antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone, these two work together. Holding on to water, holding on to minerals. Pretty neat, right? Adipose tissue, thymus, that's going to secrete thymosins. That's involved with T cell production and part of your immunity. Your adipocytes. Adipocytes or fat cells are really interesting. Besides leptin, which is a fat hormone, the adipose cells also release something called cytokines. And cytokines are involved in upregulating or increasing inflammation. So you really want to be careful. This is why obesity and being overweight or being morbid, anytime there's an excessive amount of adipose tissue or fat cells in the body, it can pretty much make any inflammatory condition worse. Whether it's cancer, whether it's heart disease, whether it is an autoimmune issue, whether it's MS, whether it's rheumatoid arthritis, whether it's fibromyalgia, whether it's IBS, it does not, whether it's diabetes, it doesn't matter. It's going to make any, or osteoporosis for that matter, which is also an inflammatory disease. It takes any amount of inflammation and makes it worse. So this is why body composition is so important. Now everyone talks about weight loss. Now weight loss could be a dangerous thing, right? Like if a person is let's say 210 pounds and 5'9", someone may say, ooh, well, that's a lot of weight for someone that short. But if we talk about body composition and that person is 90% lean and 10% fat, that's a healthy person, right? If you have someone that's 5'9" and 125 pounds, you may say, wow, that person's fit. But they could be 90% fat, 10% lean. That's an unhealthy individual. That's what we call the skinny fat. Okay, so you have to look at weight with like one eye open, one eye closed. You really have to investigate and look at body composition. It's really important, right? One of the things that I tell my patients is that I can have two glasses that have 8 ounces of liquid. They both weigh the same. They're both 8 ounces. One is 8 ounces of water. The other is 8 ounces of Pepsi, which is healthier. Okay, so now you know where I'm going. So you can have two things, two people, the same weight, that are composed of different body composition being different, fat versus lean. The more weight you have that's based on muscle, the healthier you are. The more muscle, the more mitochondria, the more mitochondria, the more ATP, the more energy production. That's the beauty to it. You exercise, you increase the number of mitochondria. That's called mitochondrial biogenesis. You're a couch potato, the mitochondria decrease in size and then you have no energy. Okay, but remember, mitochondria have their own DNA, so they can increase in number based on influences that come from the external world, whether it be exercise to go up in number or sedentary life and they start to go down. The digestive tract can produce some hormones. In particular, the duodenum right here, here's the stomach, and the beginning of the duodenum releases something called CCK. CCK stands for cholecystokinin. And cholecystokinin is going to stimulate the gallbladder to release bile. So the digestive tract can secrete a number of hormones. The kidneys secrete hormones. EPO stands for erythropoietin. Erythro means erythrocyte, like red blood cells. Poietin means to produce, so erythropoietin is involved in red blood cell production. So since all the blood is going not just to the liver, but it goes to the kidneys for filtering, the kidneys make the perfect organ to regulate blood pressure and to regulate oxygen levels. So the kidneys are going, hey, you know what? We have too little oxygen. So we're going to release EPO. We're going to make more red blood cells. So the kidney, I'm going to send this EPO to the bone marrow. We're going to push out more red blood cells. More red blood cells, more hemoglobin. More hemoglobin, heme binds to oxygen. The more oxygen delivery to the mitochondria. The more oxygen delivery to mitochondria, the more energy one has. Calcitriol is vitamin D, right? So in order to make vitamin D, you need direct sunlight, you need skin, and you need subcutaneous cholesterol. So cholesterol is extremely important. You need cholesterol on the skin. So the UV rays, especially the UVB rays, they hit the skin, they hit the cholesterol on the skin and make these vitamin D precursors. The vitamin D precursors go to the liver first, where it hydroxylates it, and it becomes 25-hydroxide. And that's why when you go to the doctors and you get your blood work checked, it's not called the vitamin D test, it's called 25-OH, 25-hydroxide. And then the 25-hydroxide goes to the kidneys, where it gets hydroxylated again, and it's called 1,25-hydroxide. That is calcitriol. That's what the body's going to be using. Okay, what else? The gonads. So now we're part of the reproductive system. So the testes and the ovaries both are reproductive, part of the reproductive tract, but the testes produce testosterone, and the ovaries are going to produce estrogen and progesterone. All right, so that's a little bit of a generalized overview. Let's look at a little bit more detail at some of the classifications. So some hormones are fat soluble and some are water soluble. Some of the fat soluble vitamins, aldosterone, cortisol, vitamin D, right? Calcitriol, which is the active form of vitamin D. Some of your sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen and progesterone. So these are fat soluble. So will some of your thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. So that means you need to have fat in your system. So when you hear of people on these low-fat diets, understand how dangerous that is, because they're limiting the amount of fat that go on receptors that allow these fat hormones to work, these fat-soluble hormones to work. So now in order to get fat on these receptors, you need a healthy liver that makes bile, and then that bile is stored at the gallbladder. So the gallbladder releases bile that emulsifies fat. Emulsify means to break down. So the gallbladder contracts. Guess when it contracts? Remember I said the duodenum releases CCK, cholecystokinin. Well, when it releases the CCK, it goes to the gallbladder contracts, and the gallbladder now pushes out this bile, and the bile is going to break down the fat. And now it can utilize the fat to put them on these target cells so that these fat-soluble hormones work. You see how dangerous it is if someone's, maybe their gallbladder is removed, and then they're not using or taking digestive enzymes properly to break down fat. Then what ends up happening is when they go and have a bowel movement, you see that the stools float, right? Whenever I speak with my patients, we talk about bowel movements because it's very important to understand not just about their digestion and how they eat, but how well they're eliminating. Now, how often do they go to the bathroom? Are they going once a week, once a day, once every 3 days, 5 days, right? And then what's the consistency of it? Does it float? Does it sink? Is it long? Are they pebbles? Is it dry? Is it wet? Does it flake off into many pieces? All of this is diagnostic, right? Of course, I preface it with, we're going to be talking about something that everyone feels uncomfortable with. No one likes talking about poop, but we talk about poop all day in my office. And then it kind of puts them at ease, right? Everyone does it. Everyone has a different odor, right? We kind of lay it out so it puts them at ease. But if they're floaters, that's a problem. That means you're not breaking down your fat properly. If you're not moving their bowels every day, that's a problem. Every single day, 1 to 2 times a day is normal. I had a patient not too long ago that had 500 cholesterol. Her cholesterol was 500. First question I asked her, she's been to doctor after doctor after doctor, and by the way, 500 is on statins. She's taking cholesterol medication, and the cholesterol was 500. Long story short, I dropped her down to under 200 in less than 10 days. Now, how was it done? Through diet. Only diet, no drugs, no medications. It was purely induced by diet as well, just because she was not moving her bowels. And if you're not removing, if you can't eliminate, then you keep recycling cholesterol. So one of the things that the gallbladder secretes, secondary to the CCK contraction, besides bile, is cholesterol. And now you have cholesterol in your intestines and colon. And that's why fiber is so important. So when you digest fiber, you can remove the cholesterol. If you're constipated, guess what happens to the cholesterol your body's producing? It keeps recycling it, reabsorbing it, your cholesterol goes up. As soon as she started moving her bowels, her cholesterol went down. But I asked her, I said, when was your last bowel movement? First question I asked her. She goes, I've never been asked that question before. And she started giggling. I said, when was your last bowel movement? She goes, what's today, Friday? I said, yeah. And she started counting back. Thursday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Monday, Sunday. She goes, 5 days ago. I said, is that normal for you? She said, yeah, about every 5 days. Once she started moving her bowels every single day, everything normalized with her cholesterol. You need cholesterol. It's so important. You need it for your sex hormones. That's why gentlemen, people, guys who are on these statin drugs need secondary Viagra, right? They need these ED, erectile dysfunction medications, because when they decrease the amount of cholesterol, then they have decreased sex hormones. So you see how one thing impacts the other. So you have to be very, very careful and be aware of these things when you're taking care of patients in the future. All right, so then we have certain gas hormones, nitric oxide. Nitric oxide, this is going to dilate your blood vessels, right? So nitric oxide, if your blood vessels are constricted, you get a high blood pressure. If they're dilated, it lowers your blood pressure. Then we have water-soluble ones. Norepinephrine, epinephrine. Remember these? These comes from the adrenal medulla, the catecholamines. See, the site of secretion is the adrenal medulla. Melatonin by the pineal gland to help you sleep. Look at these, histamine and serotonin. Look at where serotonin is produced. Platelets. Wow, your blood, this blood cell called a platelet produces serotonin? Yeah. Yep, they do. And histamine. Histamine is made by mast cells. This is a white blood cell, folks. So this white blood cell, this mast cell, is found in your skin. It's found in the respiratory tract. It's found in your digestive tract. And when you have a histamine reaction, you start talking like this, right? You sound all nasal. So when you put in a food that you become allergic to, your stomach produces histamine, and your intestines, they're going to produce histamine. And then all of a sudden, the same histamine that the stomach and the GI tract releases, it's going to act on your skin. And when you get a histamine reaction on your skin, you get itchy. Sounds like an allergy. And then the same histamine is going to swell up the nostrils, right? You're going to get that histamine reaction inside the nostrils and the nose where the turbinates swell, and you become nasal. So hopefully some of this is clicking and making a little bit of sense into the practical application of these things. Okay, what else? Let's look at, there's another classification here, also in terms of water soluble. A lot of these that we mentioned before, like ADH, growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, these hormones that are produced in the posterior and anterior pituitary, most of those are water soluble. Calcitonin by the thyroid gland, parathyroid hormone by the parathyroid gland, prostaglandins. This is a new one. So in your cell membranes, right? Remember the cell membrane? It's the phospholipid bilayer. There is arachidonic acid in there. And that arachidonic acid can be pulled out, and it can produce prostaglandins and leukotrienes. And these involved in inflammation. You're going to see this again shortly. These are classified as eicosanoids. So under eicosanoids, there's prostaglandins and leukotrienes. Women know this better than men because during that time of month, right, when you have stomach cramps because your uterus is contracting, that's secondary to prostaglandins. So you take aspirin, which is a prostaglandin blocker, and all of a sudden you feel better, less muscle contraction. But it can also reduce fever because prostaglandins spike fever. So if you block prostaglandins, you don't have a fever. Okay. Prostaglandins are also involved in making mucus in the stomach, and mucus protects the stomach lining from the acid. So if someone takes too much aspirin and you block get mucus production in the stomach, but the stomach is loaded with hydrochloric acid, guess what you get? You get an ulcer. Okay. All right. So here, lipid-soluble and water-soluble hormones, these two pictures are just showing you that they work on different mechanisms to function. Okay. All right. Hormones also work on these negative or positive feedback loops. Now, remember, negative feedback loop takes, let's say you have high blood pressure and you want to lower it. That's a negative feedback loop. If you have low blood pressure, you need to raise it. That's a negative feedback loop. If your blood sugar is too high, you need to lower it. That's a negative feedback loop. So negative feedback loops are going to be doing the opposite. Your positive feedback loops, let's say a woman is pregnant, she's going into labor, and now all of a sudden she starts pushing out lots of oxytocin. Right? So the posterior pituitary gland, the neural hypophysis, pushes out oxytocin, and the uterus contracts, and you get these strong muscle contractions. Now, you would think that because you're in pain, that a negative feedback loop would kick in and the pain would go away. But what happens? The contractions come on, they go from every 10 minutes to every 8 minutes to every 5 minutes, right? And that's how we know labor is coming on. So positive feedback loop brings on more of the same type of symptoms. Here's a picture of the hypothalamus and pituitary connection. So the hypothalamus would be up here. Remember I said it's superior? It's superior to the posterior, to the pituitary gland. And the hypothalamus and the pituitary are connected by this infundibulum. Okay? So the infundibulum is the connector between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. There's an anterior and a posterior pituitary.
Dr. Linder?
Anterior pituitary is the... Yes?
Your screen went off again.
Yes.
Your screen went off.
Oh, went off again? Oh. Okay, so that must mean I have a low connection. Give me a second. Okay, can you see me?
I can see you, but I can't see the.
Okay. Okay. Did it just log off? Did it just go down?
Yes.
Let's try it again. Okay, let's try it again.
There you go.
Can you see it again?
Yes.
Okay, thanks for letting me know.
Yep.
Thank you. So here is the hypothalamus pituitary connection. So we have to imagine the hypothalamus is up here on top, pituitary is down here on the bottom, and there's an anterior and a posterior pituitary. The infundibulum is the stalk that connects the two. It's the highway that connects the two. The anterior pituitary is known as the adenohypophysis. The posterior pituitary is called the neurohypophysis. The reason why it's called neurohypophysis is that there's these actual axons or neurological connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. Here is another view. Now you can see here hypothalamus is on top, pituitary is on the bottom. You can see that the pituitary is divided into an anterior and a posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is the adenohypophysis that produces the majority of the hormones. As you can see down below, the posterior pituitary really only releases 2 hormones. And so the hypothalamus is going to signal hormones that go to the pituitary that will release hormones to go to these target cells of these other glands. So hypothalamus is up on top. Then there's the infundibulum that connects to the posterior lobe and the anterior lobe. And you can see, although it looks like, you know, a lot of lines here, if you look to the left, the posterior pituitary is going to release adrenocorticotropic hormone. So let's break that down. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adreno for the adrenal gland. Cortico, well, if we look at the adrenal gland here off to the left, there's a cortex, which is the outer part, see adrenal cortex, and the inner part is the adrenal medulla. Cortex and the medulla produce different hormones. The cortex produces the C's, cortisone, corticosterone, cortisol, cortisone, corticosterone, all the C for cortex. The adrenal medulla, on the other hand, inside, that's going to produce the catecholamines, the norepinephrine and epinephrine. So adrenocorticotropic hormone, that hormone is going to go to the adrenal cortex, and it's going to tell the adrenal cortex to push out these glucocorticoids, cortisol, cortisone, corticosterone. Well, what are glucocorticoids? What word do you see there? Glucose, right? So it's involved in trying to increase glucose levels. And this is why they say stress kills, because when you're under stress, not only are you producing cortisol, but cortisol is a glucocorticoid. They're going to increase cholesterol and blood sugar. That's a problem. Not short term, of course, but long term, having high blood sugar and high cortisol levels weaken your immune system but raise your blood sugar. That's dangerous. All right, so that's adrenocorticotropic hormone. Then you have TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. That goes to the thyroid gland to push out T3 and T4. Then you have growth hormone. Growth hormone is going to go to the liver to produce somatomedins or medins, and they're going to help bone, muscle, and other tissue grow. Growth hormone, what's neat about growth hormone is you tend to produce it when you sleep. And that's why babies take naps so often, right? Because babies are growing so fast. So, and they also make energy quickly, and then they burn through it fast. So by napping, it allows their energy levels to get back up, and then they're wild babies all over again, right? It's why professional athletes take naps for that extra burst of growth hormone. Dangerous part about growth hormone is if you eat refined carbohydrate before bed. If you're the type that says, ooh, let me just have a little bit of chocolate. Oh, I just want a bowl of ice cream. Oh, just need a little bit of cake. Oh, just give me a little cookie before bedtime. Those sugars block the growth hormone receptors. So you may be producing growth hormone, but you're the type of individual that wakes up in the morning and then you feel tired, right? Your tissues aren't regenerated and rejuvenated. So if that sounds like you, just eliminate the late night snacks, let growth hormone do its thing, get 8 hours of sleep, and let your body regenerate. Then there's prolactin releasing hormone. Prolactin, right? Prolactin releasing hormone, prolactin, it's for the works on the mammary glands. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. Well, both the testes and the ovaries produce follicles. Luteinizing hormone. Both luteinizing hormone is released and produced by male and female reproductive. It just so happens that luteinizing hormone is one of the hormones that women look at to determine if the LH levels are high. If the LH levels are high in a urinary dipstick test, that's where she'll call the boyfriend or the husband and say, come on home, I'm ready, let's get pregnant, right? The LH means that the woman is ovulating. And there's only like really a 24-hour window, maybe at best 2 days for pregnancy to take place. When LH levels spike, that means that the ovaries ovulated, right? The ovaries pushed out an egg, and the fallopian tube and the fimbriae of the fallopian tube, this acts as like a vacuum. It sucks up the egg and it starts to move it in this direction into the uterine tube or fallopian tube, whereas the sperm are moving up in through the uterus, into the uterine tube or fallopian tube, and it's trying to fertilize the egg in the fallopian tubes. And then those cilia, those beating cilia that are in the uterine tubes or the fallopian tubes are going to push the fertilized egg back into the uterus. That's where implantation takes place, or should take place. Otherwise, they call it an ectopic pregnancy if implantation takes place anywhere other than the uterus. It becomes very dangerous. So LH levels. I have known people pick up testicular cancer using a pregnancy test. Now, it's not diagnostic, but these testicular tumors tend to push out accelerated amounts of LH. So sometimes if a man is suspicious that perhaps there is testicular cancer, and men tend to be horrible with going to the doctors, they may go to a local pharmacy, pick up a pregnancy test, pee in a cup, dip a pregnancy test in there, and if LH levels are high, that should be high enough and a strong indicator to let that gentleman know to get to the doctor and get that assessed, FYI. Okay, then we have MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone, that has some impact on the melanocyte. Then on the posterior pituitary, that's oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin is going to work on the female uterus that gives the contractions, and it's going to act on the male reproductive tract that's involved with ejaculation of sperm. This is the prostate gland here, and the ejaculatory duct goes right through it. And ADH, antidiuretic hormone, works on the kidneys to retain water. Okay, and then up on the upper right, again, you can see the abbreviations, and you can see what they stand for.
Dr. Linder, we can't see your PowerPoint.
Oh no, hold on. We're having a pretty bad wind here in New York, so let's see if we can. We back?
Yes.
Okay, so here on the top right again, you can see all the abbreviations, and you can see what they stand for. Okay, so again, it's the hypothalamus pituitary connection. The hypothalamus releases hormones, stimulates either the posterior pituitary or anterior pituitary. After it's stimulated, they release their hormones that go to these target organs and will have influence on them. Okay, so again, you can see growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, prolactin releasing hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and melanocyte stimulating hormone. This shows you the target tissues, and this shows you their primary action. So just make sure you make the time to review those once again. Okay, just skipping ahead because we've covered that. All right, let's look at the thyroid. When we look at the thyroid, we have these two lateral lobes. There's a left lateral lobe, a right lateral lobe, and then there's an isthmus. So I try and describe it as a letter H, because that's what it looks like, a letter H, and the isthmus is the horizontal crossbar of the letter H. So the thyroid has behind it, on the superior lobes and the inferior lobe, on the posterior side is where you're going to find the parathyroid gland. Just want to lay that out. The follicular cells and the parafollicular cells. So these are two things that you also have to be able to identify histologically for the lab. The follicular cells are stimulated by thyroid stimulating hormone to produce T4 and T3, and those are known as your thyroid hormones. The parafollicular cells, para means like around the follicular cells, they're going to produce the hormone calcitonin. And remember, calcitonin will regulate calcium homeostasis. How is it going to keep it in balance? Calcitonin is designed to take any extra calcium that's circulating in blood, and it's going to get rid of it in the blood. And how is it going to get rid of it? Well, it can go to the kidneys, and then you can pee some calcium out, right? You can urinate it out. It can put some in the bone, right? Because bones are made of calcium. So put some in the bone and store it. And it'll turn off the digestive tract from absorbing more calcium, right? It'll say, okay, vitamin D, we don't need you to work anymore. Because we know vitamin D upregulates calcium absorption. So here's the thyroid, right? And then down here on the bottom left, you can see that this whole thing is the thyroid follicle, right? From here to here. This is the entire follicle. And inside is the colloid. And then what surrounds it, these are follicular cells. And then around the periphery are the parafollicular cells. What's the thyroid hormone going to do? You always hear this BMR, BMR, BMR. What's BMR? Basal metabolic rate. Increases basal metabolic rate. If you have a fast basal, let's try that again. If you have a fast basal metabolic rate, this is the person that can eat cake, eat ice cream, eat potato chips, never work out a day in their life, and they are thin. The one with the slower basal metabolic rate, right? This is the person that says they just think about cake and ice cream and they put on weight. So thyroid hormone also helps to maintain body temperature. That's why when people have thyroid imbalances, you know, oh, they're cold, and then they're hot, and then they're cold, and then they're hot. Thyroid hormone stimulates protein production. It increases the use of sugar and fat for energy production, for ATP production. It upregulates beta receptors that attach to catecholamines. What are the catecholamines? Epinephrine and norepinephrine, aka adrenaline and noradrenaline. And then it works with human growth hormone and insulin to help accelerate body growth. FYI, this is the T4 to T3 conversion. What I said before is that T3 is a fat-soluble hormone, and it requires the cell membranes to have good essential fatty acids. That's why it's important. I mean, I supplement and like to supplement with my omega-3s with good fish oils. Fish oils are kind of expensive when you buy them from a good nutraceutical company. If you go into these local stores and it's like, hey, buy 2 bottles and get the third free, you typically open them up and they have that rancid smell. Good fish oils, you should be able to open the bottle, take 1 capsule out, those gelatinous capsules, put it in the freezer, and it should not freeze overnight. When you open it up the next morning, it should be soft and flexible. If it's frozen, that's why it only costs you 18 or 19 or 20 bucks at the store. Typically, good fish oils are around $40 to $50 per bottle. They're not rancid. They have good omega-3 oil. They don't freeze at frozen temperature. You're not paying for expensive water. That's why they freeze. If they're diluted with water or protein, they'll freeze. Notice the T4 to T3 conversion takes place in the liver and it requires selenium. And remember, bile acids, bile breaks down fat, and this is a fat-soluble hormone. So good thyroid, good gallbladder, good liver, healthy fats in your diet, right? Eat your avocados, have your olive oil, right? Have the good fats. Stay away from the trans fats, right? Stay away from margarine. Stay away from that stuff. But you can have butter. Butter is very, very healthy. Despite what you may hear, it comes from butyric acid. Butter is healthy. It's a good fat, butyric acid. All right. TRH, which is thyroid releasing hormone. TRH, this is secreted by the hypothalamus. Now, this is clinically important. I bring this out to you just because there's so many people that are on antihistamines, right? Like people that have allergies, sinus allergies, and they take like Benadryl and Claritin and Allegra and all of these. So thyroid releasing hormone is secreted by the hypothalamus in response to histamine, right? Now there's H1 and H2 histamine receptors. In the stomach, they're H2 histamine receptors. Up here in the brain, it's H1. That's why in the stomach, right, when someone's producing too much histamine, they call them H2 blockers. They're histamine type 2 blockers. But up here in the brain, the thyroid releasing hormone, what stimulates the hypothalamus to push out TRH is histamine. So what ends up happening is the clinical impact of regular antihistamines like Benadryl and Claritin, it can produce the subclinical hypoactive thyroid. Okay? And that's because if you have too little TRH, then you don't have anything telling the thyroid, the pituitary, to push out TSH. And then you have nothing telling the thyroid to push out T4, and then you have a hypoactive thyroid. Just food for thought. Be careful with it. So clinically, I find this in patients whenever I see gallbladder removed within years. There's typically hypoactive thyroids. So whenever there's a hypoactive thyroid, especially in women, I go, do you still have your gallbladder? And you'd be surprised. 8 out of 10 say it was removed. All right. So now I'm thinking that, it's a gallbladder issue, or I ask about the antihistamines. Do you happen to be on antihistamines? Because then the key is remove the antihistamines so that the hypothalamus can produce TRH that can go to the anterior pituitary to push out TSH, to go to thyroid to push out T4, thyroxine to get converted to T3 in the liver, triiodothyronine. Right? It's a mouthful. I know it sounds like a lot, but when you start writing it out, it makes sense. So the bile acids are needed to break down the fat so you can consume these essential fatty acids. The fats are put into the cell membranes, and your cell membranes function properly. If you have a poor liver or poor gallbladder, then you can't make bile, you can't store bile, and then all of a sudden you can't put fat in these membranes, and you get a hypoactive thyroid. Goiter. Goiter is the term that's used generally that says, okay, the thyroid is enlarged, but we don't know what's causing it, right? So goiters are generally associated with hyperactive thyroid, okay, one that's overactive. And we could see that initially with Graves' disease, Hashimoto's. You could see it with the iodine deficiency. And some of the symptoms they get is this fast, rapid heart rate, tachycardia. They can't hold weight. They lose weight. They get these puffy eyes. I'll show you this exophthalmos. They get moist skin. They're fatigued. They can't sleep. They get increased appetite, right? They eat so much, but they just can't gain weight. Graves' disease is a hyperactive thyroid. It's an autoimmune disorder known as thyrotoxicosis, but it's a hyperactive thyroid with a goiter, and they get this exophthalmos and myxedema. This is the myxedema. You see the puffiness, the bags under the eyes, this extreme puffiness. That's called myxedema. When you get the forward protrusion of the eyeballs like this is called exophthalmos. That's because there's increased amount of fat behind the eye that's pushing the eye forward. That's exophthalmos. Hashimoto's thyroiditis. Now, this is an autoimmune issue in nature. It affects women more than men, as most autoimmune diseases do. It's when there are antibodies that are being produced. Now, antibodies that resemble TSH, right? So TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone. But now there's antibodies that are attaching to these receptors. It's not TSH, but it looks like it, right? You ever tap someone on the shoulder, they turn around and go, oh, sorry, I thought you were someone else. So now these antibodies resemble thyroid stimulating hormone. They bind to it and they keep pushing out T4. And eventually it burns out. So what started off as this hyperactive thyroid becomes hypoactive. You get this a burnout effect. Okay, that's Hashimoto's. Goitrogens, these are substances in food that can suppress thyroid gland function, and it interferes with the uptake of iodine. So you have to be careful with certain individuals that may be prone to thyroid issues. So the brassica family, cabbage is a goitrogen, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, things of that nature. Soybeans, peanuts, strawberries, peaches, pine nuts, radishes, horseradish. These are all tend to be goitrogenic, so you got to be careful with those. Okay, and then review again the thyroid follicle, the follicular cells, the parafollicular cells. Just make sure that you're comfortable in identifying them and knowing what they release, what the parafollicular cells do and the follicular cells. Okay, let's look at the parathyroid gland. The parathyroid gland is, so we're looking at this individual from the posterior. So on the posterior lobes, you can see you have a right superior and a right inferior. Those are the small green little BBs over here, and you have them on the left. So they're the small, there's 4, 2 on each side, but again on the posterior side. And the parathyroid gland has 2 types of cells, chief cells and oxyphil cells. The chief cells are going to produce PTH, and the oxyphil cells, their function isn't quite known, but they find it in associated with parathyroid cancer. So now let's look at calcitonin. And let's look at parathyroid hormone. So these are working. Notice that you have 2 different cross arrows working. One is the calcitonin, the other is parathyroid hormone. So high levels of calcium in the blood are going to stimulate the thyroid gland, parafollicular cells, to release more calcitonin. And what's going to happen there is that the calcitonin has to find a way of saying, hey, how do we lower the serum calcium levels? We got to get rid of some calcium. Hey, let's pee it out, so the kidneys are involved. Let's put some in the bone, so your osteoblasts are going to build up use that calcium to build up bone. And then it's going to turn off calcitriol, right, the vitamin D, and say, hey, we don't need more absorption of calcium. Whereas parathyroid hormone is saying, hey, the amount of calcium in the blood is too low, we need to increase it. So, hey, osteoclasts, do me a favor, can you break down the bone and give me some calcium from the bone? That's a way of increasing blood calcium levels. Hey, calcitriol. Hey, vitamin D. We need you to absorb more calcium from the gastrointestinal tract, from the foods we're eating. That's a second way. Third way is, hey, kidneys, shut down. We don't want to lose any more calcium. So it's the three systems, right? You're using bone, intestines, and kidneys for both, right? It's just one is going to store it and the other is going to break it down, right? The other one's going to absorb it. The other one is going to say, hey, we don't need more absorption. One's going to pee it out, and the other one's going to say, hey, we don't want you to pee it out. But it's always the bone, the intestines, and the kidneys that are involved in both, whether we're talking about calcitonin from the thyroid gland or PTH from the parathyroid gland. Okay, so here, right, the overall effect of parathyroid hormone is to increase serum calcium. It's going to demineralize bone by increasing osteoclast activity, and it's going to decrease osteoblast activity. It's going to increase the reabsorption of calcium by the kidneys, right? And calcitriol enhances the function of parathyroid hormone and increases the absorption of calcium from the gastrointestinal tract. So all ways of increasing calcium, PTH. Let's osteoclast break down bone, kidneys, let's reabsorb it. We don't want you to pee it out. And hey, vitamin D, let's increase the uptake from the GI tract. So looking at this picture, we see the kidney, and then we see the adrenal. The other name for adrenal is suprarenal. Why is it called suprarenal? Supra is above, renal, the kidney. When we look at the adrenal gland, we'll see that the adrenals have an outer cortex called the adrenal cortex, and that's where your glucocorticoids, right? Corticoid because of cortex. So the glucocorticoids are produced in the adrenal cortex. The adrenal medulla is where the catecholamines are produced. The catecholamines are adrenaline and noradrenaline, or epinephrine and norepinephrine. Make sure you're familiar with these. I know that they like to ask this on the lab. You have to know the zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, zona reticularis. Make sure you're familiar with the zones, right? These zones are part of the cortex, not the medulla, the cortex. So besides the glucocorticoids, there are mineral corticoids. So the mineral corticoid is called aldosterone. I mentioned aldosterone on like one of the beginning slides. Aldosterone allows you to hold on to sodium, right? If you're holding on to sodium, you're probably going to hold on to water. But aldosterone allows you to hold on to that mineral sodium. So there's mineral corticoids and then there's glucocorticoids, but they're both produced in the adrenal cortex. So the zona glomerulosa is going to produce the mineral corticoids, especially aldosterone. The zona fasciculata secretes the glucocorticoids, right? Cortisone, cortisol, corticosterone, mainly cortisol. That's your fasciculata. Then there's the zona reticularis that secretes androgens. And now we're out of the cortex. Now we're in the adrenal medulla here, the inner part, right? Now that you're in the adrenal medulla, and that's where your chromaffin cells are going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine, or adrenaline and noradrenaline. So make sure you're familiar with the difference between the mineral corticoids, which regulate mineral homeostasis, especially aldosterone. It's going to regulate sodium and potassium. And then your glucocorticoids affect glucose homeostasis. That's your cortisol, cortisone, corticosterone. And then your androgens, hormones that have this masculinizing effect. So aldosterone, we said, is going to regulate sodium-potassium balance. Usually when remember how sodium-potassium, the sodium-potassium pump, they move in opposite directions. There's more sodium that's outside of the cell that wants to rush in, and then there's more potassium inside of the cell that wants to rush out because they follow their concentration gradients. This is really cool. We're going to talk about the RAS system, the renin, angiotensin-aldosterone system, super important. It is involved in regulating blood pressure. Renin, when you look at the word renin, look at the first three letters. What do you see there? Renin, renal. So renin is produced by the kidneys. Angiotensin, if we look at the word angio and tensin, it means two different things. Tensin sounds like tension. Angio, like if someone has angioplasty or an angiogram, angio relates to the blood vessels. All right, so we have some hormone, renin. You got something that's going to involve the tension of blood vessels. And then you have aldosterone, which is regulating sodium-potassium balance. So something tells me we're talking about blood pressure here. Well, let's take a look. Let's look at the RAS. I call it the RAS, the renin angiotensin aldosterone system. That would be the S. So let's take a look. First, I want you to look at the liver here. And you see the liver produces angiotensinogen. Keep in mind, for anatomy and physiology, anything that ends in -ogin always means it's inactive. So angiotensinogen is an inactive form of this, and it has to be activated. When you hear the word glycogen, right, sounds like glucose. Glucose is active. Glycogen is glucose in storage. It's inactive. When you hear of pepsinogen, pepsin is a digestive enzyme. Pepsinogen is the same thing, but in inactive form. So anytime you see the word -ogin, say to yourself, hey, Dr. Linder told me it's inactive. If it's inactive, something has to activate it. The only way you activate it is knocking off the -ogin, then it becomes angiotensin. All right? The other thing I want you to look at is renin. Renin is produced by the kidneys because the kidneys are renal. Renin. Third thing I want you to look at is the lungs. The lungs push out an enzyme called ACE. ACE is an enzyme that stands for angiotensin converting enzyme. ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme. All right, so those are the three things I want to point out. A fourth. Here's the adrenal gland. Is the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. Okay, enough said. Let's go back to step one. We have, in this particular case, person has low blood pressure, right? Low blood pressure, and that's not good for the kidneys. It's not good for your body to have low blood pressure. We always need blood and fluid going through the kidneys because the kidneys are a pump. So maybe there's dehydration. Maybe there's sodium deficiency. Maybe there's some loss of blood. There's a hemorrhage. Either way, all three of these things are going to decrease in blood volume. If you have a decrease in blood volume, you got a decrease in blood pressure. So you got a decrease in blood pressure, and your kidneys have these receptors in it that go, pressure seems low. Tire pressure seems low. Let's make the person aware. So the juxtaglomerular cells of the kidney, when you get into the kidney and you look at the functional part of the kidney, you're going to be studying something called a nephron. And the nephron has a part called the glomerulus. Just around the glomerulus, juxta means next to. So next to the glomerulus is the juxtaglomerular cells. They're regulating blood pressure. They're going, it's low. We're going to release renin. All right, what's renin's job? Remember that angiotensinogen that the liver made? Well, it's inactive, isn't it? Well, renin bumps into it, and it knocks off the -ogin. So it becomes angiotensin 1. Now, it's pretty safe to assume that if there's an angiotensin 1, there has to be an angiotensin 2. But how does angiotensin 1 get converted to angiotensin 2? Aha! The lungs. The lungs produce ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme. What does angiotensin converting enzyme do? It converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. So now the question is, what does angiotensin 2 do? It's going to increase your blood pressure. That's why people that have high blood pressure, what do? They take ACE inhibitors. right? They take ACE blockers, figuring if we can block the lungs from producing the angiotensin converting enzyme, then we can't convert angiotensin to angiotensin. I mean, we can't convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. If we don't get angiotensin 2, then you can't vasoconstrict. If you don't stimulate angiotensin 2, you don't go to the adrenal cortex. If you don't stimulate angiotensin 2, you can't stimulate aldosterone to retain sodium, right? But when you do, right, when ACE works and this person's blood pressure is low and we want angiotensin 2, now that vasoconstricts your blood vessels, so blood pressure goes up. That stimulates the adrenal cortex to push out aldosterone. That's going to hold on to sodium, and that's going to increase the water retention. That's going to increase blood volume, and your blood pressure returns to normal. Bam. That's the beauty of the RAS system. So all throughout here, this is where people manipulate physiology in terms of blood pressure, right? They'll use an ACE blocker, or they'll say, hey, they're holding on to sodium and they're holding on to water, so let's give them a diuretic. So they start losing water. If they lose water, they lose minerals. So they start to play around with it. But that becomes dangerous too. It becomes dangerous because there are people who are on diuretics, and when you lose sodium, okay, all right, maybe, you know, short term, not the worst thing in the world. But when you lose water, you lose other minerals. You lose magnesium, and then you lose potassium. And that's where you start to get electrolyte imbalances, and people, these elderly people, start to get these heart arrhythmias, and the heart could just stop. They're called ventricular ectopies, where they just die because the heart just stops as a result of it. It happens. So you have to be really careful when you manipulate human physiology with pharmaceuticals at times. I think these drugs have major effect, and I think they have major influence in crisis care situations to save a person's life. But to assume and to think that a person can remain on a particular drug for 20, 30, 40 years of their life, it's going to have impact. It's going to have impact on their liver that's filtering it. You have to be really careful. So yeah, if someone's blood pressure is 200 over 100, that's where you want them, right? You don't want them to have a stroke. But you use those medications and drugs to buy you enough time to come up with a plan that is a lifestyle plan to find out what it is that this individual is doing that's causing all this inflammation, that's raising blood pressure. Because blood pressure is a sign of inflammation in the body. You got to bring down the fire in the blood vessels. Okay, the adrenal glands, the glucocorticoids, primarily cortisol, is going to break down protein. This is especially important when you look at certain men that are under a lot of stress. I've seen quite a number of these patients over the years. I've even seen them at the gym where they have these massive upper bodies and then they have these chicken legs down below, right? That's a cortisol response. Cortisol breaks down the proteins in the largest muscles of the body, primarily the calves and primarily the quads and the hamstrings. So when you start to see the big belly effect with the skinny legs, cortisol likes to deposit fat around the abdominal area, and it likes to break down protein of the lower extremity. Cortisol is involved with trying to break down fat for fuel with lipolysis. It helps you resist stress. It's like an anti-stress hormone, but it is involved with inflammation, and it is involved with immune responses. The adrenal glands also, the major androgen, right, secreted by the adrenal cortex is DHEA. In males, after puberty, the hormone testosterone is secreted in much higher amounts than DHEA, and DHEA has virtually no effect. In females, DHEA and other adrenal androgens play a major role in promoting libido, and those are converted into estrogen. In menopausal women, all female estrogens come from the adrenal androgens. The adrenal medulla, this is the inside part, not the cortex, so it's the inner part. That's where you have the chromaffin cells that push out epinephrine and norepinephrine, or adrenaline and noradrenaline, involved with the sympathetic fight or flight response, right? Fight or get out of danger's way. That's sympathetic. So the sympathetic neural system increases your heart rate, dilates your pupils, and it dilates your windpipe, right? The trachea and the bronchi. They relax to get in more oxygen. If you have more oxygen, then you can produce more energy, more ATP. More ATP, more energy, you can get out of danger's way or fight for a long time. But it's also involved with increased blood pressure. You need to increase your blood pressure to drive that blood to all the muscles of the body to fight or flight or flight. So sympathetic is fight or flight. Parasympathetic is called rest and digest. So let's take a look. Let's understand how and why stress kills. Why can stress kill? So on the right-hand side, you're looking at chronic stress, more prolonged stress. On the left-hand side, we're looking at short-term stress, acute stress. So notice that on the left-hand side, there's a connection from the hypothalamus to your spinal cord directly to the adrenal medulla. Whereas on the right-hand side, for prolonged stress, there's connections from the hypothalamus to the pituitary. And then the pituitary releases the adrenocorticotropic hormone, adrenal gland, cortex. It's going to the cortex to push out mineral corticoids and glucocorticoids. Cortex, corticoids. Glucocorticoids for glucose, mineraloids, the mineral aldosterone for sodium, the mineral sodium. So the mineral corticoid is aldosterone for sodium balance. So let's take a look. Short-term stress. We got to run. We got to get out of danger's way. There's a tiger that's chasing us. The brain sends signals right down the spinal cord. We have no time to waste. Boom, drive it to the adrenal medulla, and we got to get out of danger's way. Let's race. Let's increase their heart rate. Let's increase their blood pressure. We need energy right away, so let's convert any glycogen. Right, there's ogen again, that's stored glucose. Let's convert any stored glycogen into glucose. They need energy and fuel. Let's open up the airways. Let's dilate the bronchioles. Let's increase their metabolic rate and get them out of danger's way. That's why they're not dealing with too many connections. It's neurological, right? Boom, spinal cord, gland, and then the hormones. Short-term response. Epinephrine and norepinephrine, that's sympathetic, that's your catecholamines. Now, short-term stress, not going to kill you too much. It's prolonged. It's chronic stress. This results in adrenal fatigue. The adrenal gland is constantly getting bombarded. Stress, right? We've been under a lot of stress lately, haven't we? So think about having the glucocorticoids, having high blood sugar, having suppression of the immune system, having and retaining sodium, having high blood pressure, high cholesterol, weakened immune system, high blood sugar. Can you see why stress kills? So you can get high blood sugar from stress. You get high cholesterol from emotional stress. Stress is stress, whether it's physical, emotional, chemical, or thermal. Stress is stress. The body cannot differentiate between it. There's bad stress, and then there's good stress, right? There's distress, and then there's eustress. The eustress is good stress. So very important to understand these connections, to understand why stress can kill people. Here's a metabolic imbalance. This is an endocrine disorder that involves excessive amounts of cortisol. So here, Cushing's syndrome is caused by prolonged exposure to endogenous glucocorticoids or exogenous glucocorticoids. It's called Cushing's syndrome, and you get this round, moon-like face. You have very thin skin. You get these purple striae, these stretch marks around the breast, around the stomach, around the back of the arms. You'll see this. You get poor wound healing. You get high blood pressure. You get this buffalo hump back here. This is Cushing's syndrome. Here's what it looks like, those purple striae. That's an endocrine disorder. Here's what it looks like on another individual. This is Cushing's. See the buffalo hump back here? See the purple striae? See the moon, the round face? See the thin skin and more of the purple striae? Okay, let's talk about the pancreas. We're getting close to the end here. So the pancreas. You should know the different parts of the pancreas. There's the tail, there's the body, and then there's the head. And the pancreas has different types of cells, but the pancreas is both a endocrine and exocrine organ. The majority are made up of these acinar or acini cells that produce these digestive enzymes. It's the other pancreatic islet cells, like the alpha cells and the beta cells, that are involved with the endocrine function. So the alpha cells and beta cells and the delta cells, these have endocrine function. Insulin lowers blood sugar, glucagon raises blood sugar. The beta cells release insulin, alpha cells release glucagon. So glucose in high concentrations is really toxic to the human body. So glucose wants to be stored. Where's glucose going to be stored? It's going to be stored in muscles, where the mitochondria are, and it's going to store it in the liver. It stores it in the form called glycogen. When glucose levels dip, glucagon is released by the pancreas. It goes to the liver and says, glucose be gone, right? Glucagon, glucose be gone. It takes the glycogen, breaks it down, and releases glucose into the system. Okay? So if we look at the seesaw effect, so down here, let's start up here. Let's look at the middle to top left. So here we have high blood sugar. So the pancreas releases insulin. It's the beta cells that do that. The insulin is going to say, hey, we need to lower blood sugar. So it's going to take glucose, store it in the liver as glycogen, and it's going to increase the cell's ability to uptake sugar. So the liver has more sugar and the cell has more sugar, but it's out of the blood. So blood sugar goes down. So what happens? The blood sugar goes back to normal. But if it declines and it dips, then the pancreas alpha cells stimulate it and release glucagon. The stimulation goes to the alpha cells and go, hey, glucose levels are too low. Glucose, go to the liver. Let's take the stored form of glucose called glycogen and break it down into glucose, and then the blood sugar starts to go back to normal again. All right, so that's the connection between insulin and glucagon. When blood sugar goes too high and it's dietarily involved, this is called type 2 diabetes, diabetes mellitus or mellitus. There's 3 cardinal signs. I call them the 3 Ps: polydipsia, polyuria, polyphagia. Poly means many. So you're peeing many times, you're drinking many times, and you're eating many times. So you have poor sugar metabolism. So you're going to be eating more food that contains fat to use fat for energy. And that's why when you're using fat for energy and you're breaking down a lot of fat and you get fat in circulation, they're worried about fat accumulation and cholesterol accumulation in the lining of the blood vessels. So they give these people statins, right? Statins have their own issues because they decrease cholesterol. Now you push and remove cholesterol from the cell membranes. Now you start to affect the sex hormones that need cholesterol, like estrogen, testosterone, progesterone. They have their own issues. So type 2 diabetes, that's dietarily involved. This, thank goodness, can be controlled and regulated by diet and lifestyle. It's your type 1 diabetes that is an autoimmune condition where the body builds antibodies against the person's beta cells. So they can never push out insulin. That's where they need to wear the monitor and or constantly have a monitor sending signals to their cell phone saying, hey, you know, when their blood sugar goes too high, they have to inject themselves with insulin. Okay, the ovaries and testes, these are part of the reproductive tract, but they do produce hormones. The ovaries produce estradiol and estrone and progesterone. Estrogen is needed to help a woman get pregnant, and then progesterone helps the woman maintain the pregnancy. They're involved. The testes produce testosterone. So testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, those are all cholesterol or fat hormones. The pineal gland, we said, produces melatonin. It regulates your biological clock. We said the thymus is involved in your immune system in helping produce T cells. Your pineal gland is up here. The thymus gland is in the chest. Okay, and we went through all of these glands in that earlier slide, so we don't have to redo it. And then we mentioned the eicosanoids. I just want to go over the eicosanoids, which are these locally acting hormones. They come from arachidonic acid. Your cell membranes are this phospholipid bilayer, and they do have arachidonic acid in them. And the arachidonic acid can be broken down and be, when enzymes act on it, they become leukotrienes and prostaglandins. Prostaglandins, this is when I said women during that time of month, they get the uterine smooth muscle contraction. When you take an aspirin, which is a prostaglandin blocker, your uterine cramps become better. But prostaglandins are also involved with helping you clot. So if you take an aspirin, you inhibit platelet function and you can bleed. So these are people, when they take aspirin, you start to see these black and blues on their back of the forearm and the back of the hand. To show you here, here's on the top, the beginning, the arachidonic acid is metabolized to produce inflammatory mediators. Many current anti-inflammatory and pain medicines inhibit some portion of the arachidonic acid pathway. So one pathway produces prostaglandins, the other pathway produces leukotrienes. The prostaglandins are involved with pain, inflammation, and swelling. When you have pain, inflammation, and swelling, you take your aspirin and you block it. Don't take it too long because you'll get an ulcer, right? That's where aspirin, ibuprofen, they're going to block prostaglandin production by blocking COX-1 enzyme. The enzyme COX-1 and COX-2, these are different. They're called cyclogenase enzyme 1 and cyclogenase enzyme 2. They take the arachidonic acid and convert it to prostaglandins. So aspirin, ibuprofen, Celebrex, right, these COX-2 inhibitors, they block prostaglandins. So people with arthritis don't feel as much pain and swelling. The leukotrienes, on the other hand, this other branch, this involves your airways. So people with asthma, they'll take leukotriene blockers or they'll take LOX blockers. This is going to be involved with decreasing inflammation, but primarily with the bronchial airways. Okay, so this is more asthma related. So aspirin, it was discovered in 1971, and it inhibits an enzyme in prostaglandin synthesis without affecting the synthesis of leukotriene. So it affects one of the branches, but not the other. So it treats a variety of inflammatory disorders. It really is a miracle type of drug. It comes from the willow, I think it's called white willow bark. And it has major positive influences and some negative ones at the same time. But if this drug was discovered today, it would probably be by prescription only. But it's over the counter, and you have to be careful with it. A lot of people use baby aspirins. Why? Well, they use it to inhibit platelet function. They use it to stop clotting, to thin the blood, right? Okay, endocrine disorders. We're going to finish up here just with a few pictures. So here is if you have too much growth hormone, right, you start to get this giantism. If you have, this is when it's in adolescence, right? So when you're still growing, it's called giantism. When it happens to an adult, it's called acromegalia, where you start to get this pronounced forehead, pronounced thick jaw. That's a growth hormone issue. Here's what a goiter looks like. Here's what the round moon face looks like with Cushing's syndrome. And here's what the exophthalmos looks like, the puffing out of the eyes. And this is a great slide just showing how the endocrine system really does influence every other system in the body. It has major impact on the skin and the skeleton and the muscles and the neural system and the cardiovascular system and the reproductive and the urinary and the digestive system and the respiratory system and the immune system. It affects them all. Okay, let's stop the recording here.